If you go to my Twitter account, I tweeted it a few weeks ago, the latest issue of National Geographic is titled The War on Science. And on the cover, they say, we never went to the moon. And then next they say, in the War on Science, that climate change isn't real. What a nice bait and switch. We always said, Moncton for 20 plus years, that it is climate change, that it's normal, that change is the only constant because of the sun and other factors. The solar winds, the list goes on. And that's what the science shows. But they get up there and lie and say, the science is in. Everyone agrees, global warming, anthropogenic, man-made. Now, the last 3-4 years, they've segued into change. Change, period. Now we're having record cold in Europe and the United States. It's freezing right now in Austin. Usually by this time of year, it's springtime here. In fact, last week, trees were budding with flowers. Now they're all basically dead because it's freezing here. It's the sun. The sun started to cool off a few years ago. Lord Moncton, but I had astrophysicists on, you name it. Not just Lord Moncton. They said, get ready for it to get cold. Get ready for the ice caps on Mars to get big again. When I had David Rothschild on years ago, I said, why are the ice caps then? That was when the Earth was still heating a little bit. It was about 8-9 years ago. I go, why are the ice caps getting smaller on Mars too? And he said, well, that's because Mars is closer to the sun than Earth. And I said, no, it's the fourth planet. We're the third. He said, no, it's not. Sorry. And I said, are you doing that to insult my audience, or you think we're that dumb? He just started laughing at me. We've played the clip of that many times. It's in my film Endgame. Lord Moncton, they seem to be tripling down now as everything collapses on them, and then trying to discredit you and others. Finish up with any geopolitical news, and then let's get into that subject, please.
All right, very briefly then, on Bibi Netanyahu's speech. I mean, this is a very important speech. It was extremely well received in Congress. Many, many standing ovations, a lot of excitement about it. And I think this is a very important and very significant moment, because Congress has decided to act unilaterally here in a way it hadn't found the courage to do so far. It invited Bibi Netanyahu when Obama didn't. Obama didn't ask him to come, but Congress asked him to come, because they are concerned that he simply doesn't have a handle on the Middle East situation, which of course stems originally from the situation of Palestine. It's really Britain's fault originally, because it was we who decided, when we had the mandate to control that territory, eventually to give it to Israel when there were still 1 million Palestinians living in it. And that has led to conflict ever since. Now, it's very clear what's got to happen. There needs to be a generous financial settlement to those who can demonstrate that they are legitimate descendants of the original Palestinians who were dispossessed by the creation of the State of Israel. That would leave Israel in place, but the Palestinians properly compensated, but they would have to accept, as the price of that compensation, that they acknowledge Israel's continuing right to exist and will no longer seek to do it down. Now, that's the kind of policy that I think we're going to need to see. And it's actually Western countries that are going to have to pay for that, because it isn't Israel's fault that Israel is there. It's our fault that Israel is there. And so we should compensate the Palestinians for what they have had to endure, the taking away of their territory to create Israel. This is a problem for Palestine. We have to understand that. But at the same time, Israel, after what was done to it before the Second World War by Hitler, Israel also has its right to exist as a nation. And that way you can get both nations coexisting, I hope, in harmony. Something like that has got to be tried, because otherwise the conflict between the West and the Islamic world, which has largely stemmed out of the Palestinian conflict, is not going to go away, and it is, I'm afraid, going to get worse. And I'm very sorry about that, because my late father spoke Arabic, looked quite Arabic in some ways, knew many of the leading figures in the Arab world, and was very fond of it. And so am I. And it's a great sadness to see this really unnecessary disturbance of the former harmony there, and the savage treatment, in particular, of the Christians in Syria at the moment, and other places in the region, where hundreds of thousands have been dispossessed or killed. and virtually nothing said in the fashionable left-wing press. Well, that's why Bibi Netanyahu is being received so well in Congress, because he is speaking to these issues which the present administration in the United States has nothing to say about.
In closing on the subject, why won't the feminists that say a man wearing pants hurts women, or that all sex between a man and a woman is rape, literally, why aren't they upset when radical Islamists sexually mutilate women or cut their heads off or kill Christians or put little girls into sex slavery? Why would the left, is radical Islam so sexy and chic? If you go to a leftist meeting, there are folks there just fawning after it. It's so sexy to be in a jihad slave pit.
This has always been the way that the media and the left are by instinct not democratic but totalitarian. And totalitarians will always tend to stand together and think as one. And of course, there's the additional factor that Obama has been letting very large numbers of Muslims into the United States. And this is because the first few generations of immigrants from wherever they come tend to vote left. And so the left always have policies which seem terribly tough against immigration, but in fact you always get very, very large numbers of people coming in, and in particular at the moment from the Muslim world into the United States, changing forever, as they hope, the terms of trade in voting to make sure that we never really ever get a Republican government again. That's the aim of it. It's the constant movement leftward. And that's why the left makes common cause with the terrorists and the extremists of Islam, rather than doing what the centre-right does, which is saying actually that sort of conduct is unacceptable.
All right, Lord Monckton, good analysis on that front. Let's segue into the latest on the carbon taxing, how they're responding to record cold temperatures, record thick ice sheets, record numbers of polar bears and pinguinos. What's happening on that front?
Well, let's first of all, you're quite right about this. There are 7 times as many polar bears as there were in the 1940s. Hardly, as you may think, the profile of a species at imminent threat of extinction. And yet the Worldwide Fund for Nature, so-called, which is another communist front group, has put out an advertisement in the United Kingdom, which doesn't appear on their website because they don't want people actually getting the text of it and then making complaints about it, which says that polar bear numbers are in decline. Well, they're not. They're growing very rapidly because the Arctic, it has been a little bit less warm than it had. There's been a little bit of a loss of ice there, but it's been more than matched by a gain of ice in the Antarctic. And overall, just a few months ago, for the time of year, there was more sea ice globally than had ever been measured in 35 years of the satellite coverage. You will not see that in any mainstream news media. You'll only see it on Alex Jones. But the fight back is now even beginning among the scientific community. The paper that I and 3 distinguished colleagues, Professor David Leagate, Dr. Willie Soon, and Dr. Matt Briggs, published in January in the Chinese Science Bulletin, is the most popular paper in terms of the number of downloads that distinguished journal, it's the Oriental equivalent of Science or Nature, has had for any scientific paper published in the last 60 years of its archive. In fact, it's had more downloads than the others by just about 10 times over. This has proved to be a very popular paper because it's actually quite a simple paper. What it does is to set out an irreducibly simple climate model, which is a way of looking at the climate. And what you can see in the paper is that when we ran that model for the first time, the answer it gave was exactly the rate of warming that we've in fact seen over the last 30 years, whereas the official models are predicting twice as much warming as has actually occurred. Now, this paper is a phenomenon. It's of great concern to those who are trying to say at the UN's climate conference in December in Paris, where they hope to inflict a world government treaty on us, the one they failed to do at Copenhagen. They're going to try again. The Chinese blocked the Copenhagen one. The Chinese have been squared by, as of course, Obama this time. He went over there and said, look, please don't wreck the treaty this time. We'll let you out of it. You can go on emitting as much CO2 as you like.
That's right. They never comply with any of it. They can build all the new plants they want. Pachari can in India, even though he just lost his position. We can talk about that. It's only on the West that these cuts are made.
That is absolutely right. And what is interesting is that China has been given a specific exemption, so it doesn't have to cut its emissions at all. Now, the point about that is that China is now far and away the largest emitter of CO2 on the planet. So if CO2 were a problem and you were wanting to control it, the one country you wouldn't let out of this agreement is China. And the other one that you've just mentioned that you wouldn't let out is the second largest emitter, or soon will be, and that's India. And so what they've really said is that in order to get some sort of a treaty through, they're going to have to exempt the people who are now the major contributors to the CO2 in the atmosphere. That's how dotty it has all become. But the reason why they're pushing for this, desperately pushing for this treaty, is they now know the science has collapsed. Our paper, among others, tells them it's collapsed. But they can't admit it, and their only way of not being shown up as having got it as badly wrong as they did is actually to bring CO2 concentration down to zero, so that when, as they now know it would anyway, the temperature fails to rise, they can say they did that with their heroic cuts in CO2 rather than it wasn't going to happen anyway. But of course, this paper has provoked outrage and screaming fury on the left. At first, they tried to poo-poo it, saying that the journal it was insignificant. Then they discovered it is the Journal of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the largest such thing in the world. Then they tried various very dopey attacks on the science, which fell completely flat because most of them are plainly not even